guys, Matt Easton here. So I'm filming a quick video on the hop because I've just uploaded or made public a video about Viking sword hilts and how to grip them. And yet again, people are coming with the same old trope that we see time and time again, and we've seen since the 19th century in fact, of, oh, but people in the old days were much smaller, so that's why their sword hilts are smaller. Equally, in the 19th century, it was popular to say, oh, well, you know, people in India are much smaller, so that's why their sword hilts are smaller. No, that's not why the sword hilts were smaller. First of all, people in the Viking Age were only very slightly shorter on average than people today. In Anglo-Saxon London, according to reports from the Museum of London Archaeological Service, based on a survey of many dead people from London, from the various cemeteries of London, in the Anglo-Saxon period, the average height of men was 5'8". When I was growing up, the average height of UK men was 5'9", a mighty 1 inch taller. Now, in fact, since I was about in my late 20s, I think, it's gone up to 5'10". Okay, so we're actually 1 inch taller now than when I was a kid, and that was only 1 inch taller than Anglo-Saxon times, 1,000 years ago. Okay, so firstly, there isn't much difference between Anglo-Saxon period and now in terms of average heights in London. There was in the industrial period a period where it went down because sanitation was awful, living conditions were awful, people had bad nourishment and every other thing you can think of that contribute towards lower height. But in the Anglo-Saxon period they had fairly good living standards because they weren't living in built-up areas with you know, terrible sewers, and they were getting a fair amount of good quality food. So they were pretty much the same size as we are now. But more importantly than that, it doesn't really affect hand size. Okay? The main thing dictating your height is the length of your legs. If you look at a person who's 5'5" and a person who's 6 foot, you'll very often notice they have the same length bodies, more or less. Okay? And they have a similar size hands. It's generally speaking limb length that seems to be affected by nutrition. Actual core body size, if you look at someone who's what we might call a dwarf or a small person, very often you'll notice they have fairly large bodies and heads. It's their limbs that are short. If you look at the hand size of someone from my group who's half a foot shorter than me, their hand size won't be very different to me. We all wear the same size gloves. Okay? We don't all need different gloves because we've got wildly different size hands. No, we actually have more or less the same size hands pretty much regardless of our height. Yes, some people have big hands and some people have small hands, but it actually doesn't vary very much. Whether we're talking about Indian swords or whether we're talking about Viking swords, really the whole argument about average height across periods of time is a misnomer, firstly. But secondly, even if there is a variation in the average height, that doesn't make very much difference to the hand size. The fact is that Indian sword hilts and Viking sword hilts are tight to the hand for very specific reasons to do with how those swords were used. Okay? So don't fall into the trap, the same trap that our Victorian ancestors fell into, of assuming that because a sword is tight to your hand, it must be because we are bigger and stronger and meatier than our ancestors, or than a person in another country or from another culture. It's not always the case, and in fact I would go as far as to say it's not usually the case. Usually it's the case that a sword hilt is tight to your hand because that is how people who used that type of sword knew that worked best with the type of fighting style that they employed that sword with, and that it worked best for how they wanted to use it. Okay guys, cheers!
Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.